Cool. So if I seem like I'm half asleep, it's because I've been here a week and I'm still jet lagged and I am half asleep. But hopefully this is coherent. Yeah, so as Mikhail mentioned, I work at Dropbox. I've been there like a year and a half now, but we're not going to talk about any of that today. Specifically, like I want to talk about Sentry. How many of you like use Sentry or at least know what it is? Pretty good. All right, that's cool. So this story should be pretty interesting. So like this is Sentry for anybody who doesn't, which seems to be very few of you. It basically is like an error logging application. And it's kind of like this thing that was like born many years ago and was like kind of open source. I want to say like entirely the whole time. But the way it started is kind of an interesting story. So I joined Disqus a long time ago, 5 years or something ago. And when I joined, they were using this project that I had written as kind of an example piece of code called Django DB And all this was if you're familiar with the Django admin, this was just like a really awful way of aggregating like errors and showing it like in a simple fashion. So like I actually don't have any pictures of it because it was pretty terrible and I refused to find them. But when I joined, like Disqus was actually using this, and it was a piece of crap. I couldn't believe anybody was actually using it. So like the next month, right after I started, we built what we called Django Sentry, which we took Django DB and we like turned it into this actually like kind of useful thing. It was still pretty ugly actually, like in retrospect, but it was better than what we had before. So we were making progress, right? 2011 came around, and I believe this is when we made Sentry no longer a Django thing. So it used to be you'd drop this in your Django application, and it would just work. And now it's like much more complicated to set up, and you have to deal with all this other stuff. But that's when we like finally really had like a kind of an interesting project. By the way, can everybody hear me okay? It sounds like this echoes a little bit. It's all good? Okay. Also, the big thing here is like we convinced somebody to actually help with the design, so it was no longer me building things. And actually, like today, it doesn't look too much different. And this is like a 4-year iteration, I guess. We went from something pretty awful to arguably one of the better looking tools in the space. And the interesting thing about this is like we started the company and there's literally just 3 of us. 2 of us worked on it for a long time. Both of us, myself and Chris, the other co-founder, we were at Disqus for a long time together. And then the other guy actually works at Disqus still today. But the more interesting thing is that like a lot of this is maintained by the community. A good example is like we support platforms I didn't even know were a thing, like Elixir. I had never heard of this before a few weeks ago, and I guess there's a Sentry client for it, which is kind of cool. And officially, it's become complicated because like as a company now, we try to support like these platforms, and like I don't write Java. I hate JavaScript. I hate Ruby. Like I can't stand dealing with these languages, but somehow we sort of maintain them. But realistically, like these are the only 2 things we deal with. So the way that kind of works is like we have this big community. It's kind of fostered over the years. Like we built this really cool open source project. Everybody could use it. We made it easy to set up. But it wasn't all like awesome like that. So like the unfortunate truth is that all of the commits are me. Like we have a bunch of contributors, but nobody is writing any of the server code. And that's actually not bad. Like, I mean, it means like we have a pretty consistent quality. Like the code all looks the same because I wrote all of it. But we actually have like a huge ecosystem of developers either way. Like they don't necessarily contribute to the server, but they contribute to other projects. So like a few of these are like the clients, but a majority of these are like integrations with other services that other people have just written. And it's actually pretty interesting. So we track like how many people contribute to Sentry like throughout like all the projects we can like scrounge off of GitHub, and we've got like 800 committers to different Sentry projects, which is honestly kind of exciting. And that's like from what we're tracking, that's around 50 different like unique projects, and I think that includes the core project as well. So like one of the big lessons that we got out of this was like it's not open source because other people are gonna like maintain the server. Obviously, like if all the commits are me, it's that like other people are gonna help. They're gonna like drive these initiatives that we won't drive. So like you know, we didn't care about Java, even though we maintain it now. Like there's like a big Java ecosystem that uses this. There's like a big Ruby ecosystem, and like even before this, like we didn't care about JavaScript, and that's a huge amount of our market now. And it's it's all like these things that were really interesting to people, and they wanted to build it, and we allowed them to build it. So like we fostered a lot of a community outside of that. And like one of the things that I always get asked, so like we built this inside of Disqus, and then we launched a company out of it, which is a little bit shady. For the record, everybody was cool with it, but there are interesting like side effects of this. So like internally at Disqus, this helped a lot with recruiting. Like we could not hire anyone. It's actually really hard in San Francisco, and Disqus we're a reasonable name in like the Python and Django world, but there aren't that many Python and Django developers. So whenever somebody would come in, about 50% of the time, it'd be like, oh yeah, we saw Sentry or something like that. And that was actually really, really valuable, and it still is today for them. So like people always ask, like, how do you convince your company to let you build things like this? Like, especially if you're just going to go like spin it off into a company, and it's just like the company gets like huge obvious benefits out of it. And like the big takeaway is like it should take minimal effort. I think if you have to spend a lot of time convincing your company that open source is good, you should maybe find another company to work for. It's kind of a reasonable way of thinking. Another example of this is like I joined Dropbox a year and a half ago, and like one of the first things I said is like I want to build open source software. And so like most of this stuff I actually build at Dropbox is like completely open source and has been since day one. Nobody uses it except us, but it's potentially really cool technology that's just like pretty early and young. And it's kind of interesting because we talk about this and everybody jokes like, oh yeah, when you leave Dropbox, are you going to take this project and start another company out of it? Maybe. But it's cool. Like in Dropbox like is a forward-thinking company, and like they absolutely see the benefits out of it. So it was like minimal effort to convince them. It's just like I think the main argument you always see is like taking in a big existing project and making it open source is probably not worth it. It's very hard. But like from day one, if it's open source, it's really easy. And that's what we did, and it actually has turned out pretty well. So this talk isn't just about open source, though. It's like, how do we create a business out of it? And there's a few of these that are like kind of interesting case studies. I don't think there's a lot that operate the same way as Sentry. A lot of them are like technologies like React or MySQL or something else that's kind of like owned by a bigger company, and they offer support contracts, which is like completely the opposite of what we do. Like we purely offer like a subscription service. But like, why did we decide to do this? Because like, it wasn't that we were building Sentry just so we can start a company and like, build a business out of it. It became like a side effect. And it was actually like one of my friends at Heroku, his name is Craig Kirstens, and like he's just like, why don't you create a Heroku add-on out of it? I'm like, okay, but why? And it came down to it's like, well, maybe you'll make it like a few extra bucks off of it. I'm like, oh, that's kind of cool. And I figured it would be pretty easy, right? Like, oh, Heroku add-on, I must just like create a script and it install Sentry for them or something. It turns out that's not how it works at all. So that began like a fairly rigorous process of fixing Sentry to where it could act as like this shared service provider. And it was like 3 months to do this, but it actually wasn't that much effort. It was just that we were very slow about doing things. What I think was really interesting is like, so we started this as a Heroku add-on, and Heroku was taking their time validating the add-on. So we're like, what if we just allow people to subscribe without Heroku? And it turns out that's what the majority of people wanted. So we actually implemented Stripe. And I don't know if Stripe is like all over in Europe yet, but it is an amazingly easy API to use. And it provides like to where we still had to build like no tooling around our billing management, and it kind of deals with all of it for us. I know they've been like working towards expanding. I just don't know how far they've gotten because it's a pretty difficult problem from what I understand. But yeah, so like we spent a little time like, okay, like Heroku's taking forever. Some people are uninterested, so we implement Stripe, and then it was like 2 days later, and we had a first paying customer. This is again the guy that works at Disqus, which was pretty cool. And he's probably one of the best hires Disqus has made, and it all came through like this Sentry ecosystem. So again, like more and more validation for open source. Also, interestingly enough, he's a Python developer and an operations person, but he also wrote the JavaScript and the Node clients. And somehow we maintain those, and we're like, I kid you not, the worst JavaScript developers you can imagine. And again, like a very easy hire for Disqus. I remember when like Matt came in, it's like, oh yeah, I use Sentry. And I'm like, oh, I recognize you. Like, and this is after he had written the Node client. I'm like, we should absolutely hire this guy. And it was a really, really good thing. And I think we had a few other people like that. So it kind of made it very obvious for like Disqus to continue like supporting in the best way it could. So part of that, like, we had to decide, like, if we're going to build a business, like, we need some, like, morals, kind of, like, we need a set of direction we want to, like, maintain. And a lot of companies have these, like, what is Facebook's now? It's, like, move fast and don't break things or something. So, like, kind of those, you know, mottos, but, like, we really wanted something to focus on, like, how we're building the product, not so much, like, how we're building a company, because, I mean, there's 3 of us. It doesn't really matter. So number 1 was like nothing is free. Like if you want to like use the project, you can just host it yourself, and that's kind of something that like for me as a big open source person, it took a while to agree with this. I'm like, yeah, but we could offer like the free like a free trial or like a free account, and we still sort of do, but like these days we're just like, no, like if you want to use it for free, go host it yourself. We're catering to people who want to pay for the hosted service, and I think that's fair. Like if you're working on something, you should get paid for it. And so it had to be sustainable. This is part of that. Like you never want to lose money. Like I promise you, I've quit so many side projects because I could not make them turn any kind of reasonable profit. So that was a lesson from day 1 here. But it's, yeah, like we have a huge amount of companies that use Sentry, and about 50% of them actually just host it themselves, and we're okay with that. It doesn't really matter to us. Number 2, going back to like, I hate like big companies and stuff, was like don't overcharge. When you pay like GitHub Enterprise used to be like this. You'd pay like $50. Actually, maybe it's 50 now. I don't know. It was a lot of money, and you'd pay per person, and that the pricing kind of like makes sense there, like the per seat pricing, because it might scale to like the company and everything. But like realistically, that's not the kind of company we were trying to build. So we said day 1 we're going to charge for what costs us money, and that's purely like how much data are you sending us. It turns out that's actually really complicated because you have things where like Python is expensive and PHP is cheap, and like Java people are just ridiculous. But overall, I think this works pretty well. It's definitely something like we're considering there might be better options, especially with like enterprise customers. They probably can cause significant problems. Like they'll DOS the service just because they have so many errors. And like kind of the most important to me was like open source first. And the goal of this was like, we always will keep it open source. We're not going to like fork it. We're not going to like have our own custom version that we're running. We're going to keep everything open source. And actually what we do is we just run the latest build from master all the time on getsentry.com. And this has actually been like a really big challenge for us for a long time because, I mean, the hosted service has billing, right? And then billing gets super complicated. And these are still like ongoing problems for us. It's like we need all these kind of like hooks and tools in place to actually make it work as a company, but everybody that's hosting it, they could care less about this. And then we have the challenge of like, we really actually want to keep it easy for everyone just because we just want everybody to use it. So it's like, how do we make sure it's easy for us to offer the paid premium service, and how do we make sure it's still easy for people to install it where they don't have to jump through hoops that don't matter, right? And kind of part of that was like, we don't really care about other people's ideas. It's like, we built the product, it works very well. We built it for our use cases, which granted don't solve everyone's problems yet, but like it's strictly like build the product that we want and keep it how we want it to be. And this was like one of the big challenges with the business side of things, because everybody wants features. And I'm like a terrible customer support person. Like I actually just don't answer feature requests most of the time because I don't want to say, no, we're not going to do that. But that's the gist of it, is like, we'll build it if we think it's the right idea. And usually, like, if we think it's the right idea, I would hope that we figured it out before somebody asked us about it. Super, super important. I mentioned this earlier, is like keeping things lean. And there's this trendy saying, there's a lot of trendy sayings in San Francisco and Silicon Valley. One of them is like this lean startup idea. I'm not quite sure what that means anymore. It's gone in a lot of ways, but this is specifically like, don't spend money. Like, keep everything as cheap as possible. Don't lose money. And this was like super important for us early on. Like we bootstrapped the company, and since day 1, it's actually been technically profitable because we convinced people to like give us favors and like free hosting and things like that. So like an example of this was when we were talking to Heroku for the first 3 months. I think we were actually hosting our servers, like we were using Heroku as a service to host Sentry. And so for the first 3 months, they actually paid all of our bills, which was actually really, really expensive. And then we like moved on. After that, I think we were with like some really cheap dedicated server company where like, I don't know, it was like $150 for some like beefy server. It was the craziest thing you can imagine. And then we moved on to another program which gave us like $1,000 a month. And it was just like, we kept finding ways to minimize the costs until it made enough money that we could actually afford things ourselves. And like I mentioned this before, but like if you take a loss, it's why would you keep doing it? Like it may be fun to run it on the side, but like it's a business, and if you're paying out of pocket just to offer a service for somebody, that's not really fun. And eventually you're just going to throw it away. So like this, because it's sustainable, it really, really drives the fact that we keep developing it and that we like cater to like the needs of people. And it like for us, it's interesting because it also makes it easy for us to offer nice things to people. Like, I mean, in all fairness, like if you email me and ask for a free account, I'd probably just give it to you as an example. Yeah, and I mentioned Heroku covered our bill, which was super awesome. Fortunately, we had to switch off of Heroku because the dynos are just not very well suited for heavy Python processes. I mentioned also that we got a hosting company to give us money each month. So like SoftLayer, which is a big company in the US, I think they have some data centers elsewhere now. They have an incubator program, and all we had to do was like email them and say like, look, here's our company. And they gave us $1,000 in credit for an entire year. And I think it was like, it wasn't until like 6 or 8 months later that we actually were spending more than the credit. And by that time, like, I mean, you're spending $50. If you're not making $50 by that point, like, I mean, you should probably rethink the business. But the big thing was like always day one, like charge money. And this is always interesting because like, especially in Silicon Valley, especially with like the bigger companies, it's like there is legitimate value in growing a big company like Twitter. I don't know if Twitter's profitable yet. They're probably not. But they could be profitable if they wanted to be. And so you have this like weird line of like, oh yeah, what if we grow? And then we can charge money after that. But it's, I don't know, it's a fine line. And especially like we were bootstrapping the company. It was a side project. You got to charge money. And I think that's also important because it gives like a real business model. We talk to, we entertain, I'll say, a bunch of calls from like venture capitalists these days because Sentry does reasonably well. It started as a side project, which is super impressive to a lot of these people. But it's always like, this is why we were able to be that, is because from day one, it's like, yes, we're going to price it this way. Yes, we're going to do this. And I think we've increased prices like 4 times because it had to make sense as a business. I mentioned this a little bit, like with always being open source. This is really, really complicated for us. I think there's been like a year-long thing where we've tried to make billing not confusing. And there's just all these problems that are really specific to a hosted service and that you just don't see at all when you're self-hosting. And then there's all these other things where people are requesting things. As an example, it's like we have this awesome hosted platform, but somebody wants X feature. It's like, well, now we're charging them money. And like, do we need to build that for them? They're probably not going to build it themselves because they're paying us. So it's like really confusing when we try to push our customers to be like, hey, yeah, it's open source. We don't really care about this, but feel free to contribute. And that's still an ongoing challenge. I'm not quite sure how to resolve that one. But yeah, again, the subscription stuff, that was super complicated. For early on, we had to have like rate limiting. That was part of our billing cycle, right? Like, you pay for sending X amount of data. And so we didn't have any of these features in Sentry Core, and it's like, well, nobody really needs this like rate limiting in their like self-hosted version. Turns out that wasn't true, and it's actually a super useful feature. And I think that's kind of one of the takeaways we got was like, if you like step back and look at a lot of the things you might build in a platform, like generally there's a way that it will make sense for things. So like I mentioned the billing model issues. Like the problem there is like if you're familiar with GitHub and how like confusing organizations are, we were trying to avoid that same problem. Like you have an organization and then a repository that's attached to that organization, and then you have your user, which is like its own organization, and then you have like billing attached to each of these, and like managing teams is a nightmare. And for the longest time, GitHub was like really, really confusing and really complicated to use. So like we saw that, and we didn't want to have that same problem, so we avoided building any of this, and that's kind of led to this weird line of like some of the features don't make sense at all for us, and then the other features are just really hard to implement because we never went down that path. And then, a few years later, we're like, okay, we're changing our minds. We're going to go back and we're going to deal with the complication. So what we ended up actually doing was like Sentry is full of all these hooks, which is, I think, actually why a lot of people have been able to contribute. Like we have it's a pretty plugin. It's a pretty bad plugin system. But it was like good enough that everybody was able to contribute. So like we have GitHub integration, and that's like 20 lines of code, and they just have to drop in this plugin. And I don't think we wrote that. I don't think we wrote like 99% of the integrations, but they all like are really simple because everybody's like, oh, I see this. Oh, I can just contribute this, and it has made it really good for the community. But then we have all these like obscure extension points for Git Sentry, like I mentioned, the rate limiting and stuff, and that's always been our biggest challenge. But I think it's getting better, and the code actually is starting to look like a reasonable project. And this is kind of like some of the scariest stuff is like we just started adding things into core Sentry that nobody's ever going to use, but it may be useful. I don't know. Like, is everybody familiar with StatsD? It's a tool for like recording like statistics from your application, more or less. So for us, it's like we want to know how slow it is to send an event to Sentry, like how long it takes us to process it. Like you probably don't really care about that if you're using like the self-hosted version, but it was just too hard to actually build in extension points for this. So we just started dropping in code in Sentry, and then a lot of things will just like be disabled, or they'll have like some no-op behavior, which is kind of bad, especially with Python. It's not super cheap to do this stuff. So like we're calling a bunch of functions that just do nothing for like anybody that's running self-hosted, which just makes it slower. But it was like the trade-off we had to make. It was like this. Otherwise, we having to like we like import code inside of the Git Sentry code base, which just installs Sentry, and then you'd have a bunch of hacks on top of it, and it was just like super dirty. In fact, the Git Sentry code base is still super dirty, and it will never be open source for any number of reasons, but that's a good one. So it came down to like how are we going to cater to the customers? And I mentioned this earlier, but it's like we build a product that we really love. And like the idea is that, I assume that you all love it as well. And that was minimal effort. Like we didn't talk to you, we didn't cater to you. It just, it made sense. It solved our problem, which I also think is why like it's really cool we were able to do this with Sentry. It's like something that's super interesting as like a developer that you can go in, build a tool that fits your needs, and then somehow turn it into a business. And it like, if you self-host, we care a little bit less about you. I'm just going to be honest. You can contribute, it's open source, etc. But we still treat our self-hosted users as customers. Like some of the biggest customers don't pay us any money. And like we absolutely help them whenever we can. And these are like, honestly, like almost every big name customer that uses Sentry hosts it themselves for any number of reasons. And so it was important to us that like we made sure we catered to them, because that has actually led to a good thing where the people will use Sentry inside of their company, and then they'll go do like a startup or something else, and then they'll be like, oh yeah, we can just pay for the hosted service. And that's actually really cool. I don't know if the cost is worth it yet, but it hasn't been too hard. Usually actually like, this is really unfortunate, but the people who host it themselves are super self-sufficient, whereas like the people who pay us like $10 a month are usually annoying and asking way too many questions. But again, it was like, we take care with the product, and that's kind of led to this like nice organic growth. And this was something like, I'm a CEO, which is the weirdest thing in the world, but I have no idea what I'm doing with business or marketing or sales or any of this. And so we basically just gave up on all this. I think we do a little bit, and the designer deals with it now, but like we could not find a way to effectively market or like convert people, etc. Like I know nothing about this. I'm sure there's a way, but and I think because we built this really cool product and the way we approached open source has actually let it just like grow on its own. And that was like I said, like as soon as we launched billing, we had a paying customer right off the bat. And I think actually like when we launched, it was like the one guy signed up, and then like 15 other people immediately signed up, and that was pretty awesome. And then everybody also immediately followed up with like, this is super cheap, we would pay more. And that was actually a good lesson. But the cool thing is that like we can build something really awesome, and we don't really have restrictions of anything. Like we built a product that we enjoy. It turns out other people enjoy it, and we can just keep doing that. It's not like Disqus has always had this long problem. It's this like commenting platform, but they need to make money off of it somehow. Like because we have this like really solid, simple business model, people just pay us. They're paying for this service. It's like this really like solid application and idea, so people are happy with it, and that lets us just continue what we're doing. Where like we just get to build cool stuff. And actually, I think like Dropbox is sort of a similar example. Like they don't have to deal with advertisers. They build a client that you pay for more or less because you pay for space, which means like as a company, Dropbox can just build like really cool features as long as it caters to the customers. There's never like the advertisers that are pushing agenda, which is actually really nice. But again, like we're not a real company. I'm definitely not a real CEO. And we just built this because we had problems and we wanted to solve them. And I think this is like, GitHub is very admirable, I think, for a lot of their internal tooling. Unfortunately, like none of it is open source, but they have some really, really cool stuff. They even have like a Sentry that they built internally, and it's really nice looking. And I think it's like they put a lot of care into the problems that they had and they wanted to solve. And like for a company, I feel like for your culture, that's really good. Like I can reflect on this in Dropbox where we have a lot of duct tape, I'll say, and there's not a lot of like really pretty internal tools, and it's a different feeling. But it's also fun because it doesn't feel like a business. I mean, I'm not committing code to like solve some business agenda. Usually, it's like, oh yeah, this would be a cool feature to add. Let's do that. And so it just feels like we're working on a side project still, even though it does reasonably well as a business now. But like, the interesting thing is for, I don't know, it's been what, more than 2 years now? We were full-time at other companies. Like we left Disqus shortly after starting the project, but then I went to like a little company and then Dropbox eventually, and my co-founder went to GitHub for a while. And it just like meant like we spent lots and lots of evenings working on the project. It was kind of okay because we had like the 3-year investment of building it at Disqus that actually made it like a good product, but it was still like a pretty good time commitment. And this is kind of doable for some people. Some people like have normal life balance. I don't really have that. But interesting, like as of a few months ago, like my co-founder who now lives in like rural East Coast, the US, has a wife and a kid and another kid coming on the way, and he actually was able to quit his job and he's now working on Sentry full time, that's pretty sweet. And like, you know, going back to like the company validation, like Disqus still gets a lot of interest purely because of Sentry. Like even like just the hosted or the like our SaaS service like is actually still valuable to Disqus because it keeps spreading what started at Disqus. And eventually, like if you're a technology person, you probably like read a little bit of background about open source tools, or like you figure out like the company that they came from or something. That's like still hugely valuable to the company. And this is like, you know, we haven't worked there for a couple years now, and it's interesting to see that cascade. And like I think more importantly for me is like, you know, started it for beer money, and we actually get to do a lot of cool stuff. Like you've probably all seen, like if you use Django, you've probably seen like the Django Kickstarters. There's like a template thing, and there was a few others. So we just unquestionably like donate to that stuff. That said, don't like just create a campaign. It's like we're going to support G-Event on Python 3. We sponsor like PyCon US every year, even though like we don't really care about the sponsorship. And it's actually really nice to just be able to do those things and not have to worry about it. And I think, I don't know who said this. I'm sure somebody did. But this is a quote that like really resonates with me for the project. And it's like, if you do what you love, you'll never have to work a day in your life. And I think that's true. And I think like as engineers, a lot of us probably feel that way. I'm sorry if any of you work at like a big corp company and it's kind of uninteresting work, but definitely this has kind of always been the thing that's kept me into engineering. But yeah, that's it. The story of Sentry. Thank you. So are there any questions? All right, who's going to be first? You're in charge. It's in your benefit to ask questions, I'm told. It's absolutely worth it. As a side note, don't tell all my coworkers, but I'm leaving Dropbox in a couple months, so it's absolutely worth it.
Okay, I've got a kind of technical question about Sentry, as you mentioned it. I wonder if you built this from scratch nowadays, would you use SQL paradigm for exceptions? Because this SQL don't seem like best use case for exceptions, because exceptions are quite elastic themselves.
Yeah.
So it looks more like documents, for example. because when I tried to make some analysis on exceptions, like let's get count per user for exceptions, so to get to know how many users generated this exception, or maybe just one user.
Yeah.
Then I found there are blobs in your database, and that was very scary for me.
It's I wouldn't build it exactly the same way if I were building it from scratch today. That said, we have an internal tool at Dropbox that was there long before I joined. Very similar to Sentry, not quite the same. It doesn't provide the same level of features. It's modeled identically. They have, so SQL's great at indexing, and that's a hard problem. So they have a SQL indexer, and then they have a blob store, which for them is HBase. For us now, it's React. And honestly, like, probably over the course of, like, we're working on like a new release, which is mostly like, it's a new design and a few new features. But after that, our first goal is to tackle, like, how do we get rid of SQL? Like, we want to be able to, like, still allow you to set it up with SQL, but like drop that dependency entirely for us, because like we have a pretty monolithic database. In total, we probably have like 16 or so terabytes of data on GetSentry.com. And I mean, most of that's in React now, which has helped a lot. But when that was all in SQL, it was very scary. And SQL is very hard to scale for any number of reasons. Mostly like exception data isn't really transactional, but you can't turn those features off in like a SQL database. So like you end up with a lot of like extreme cost for something that you don't really need. So yeah, if we were going to rebuild it from scratch, we would do what we're slowly doing, which is like there's a blob storage, and you could use a document store, like it doesn't really matter to us. But then there's like an indexer, which for us will either be like React Search, or it'll be Solar Cloud, or it'll be Elasticsearch or something. So like we're slowly making it there. But yeah, definitely like if we were to start over, we would design it very differently.
Okay, I just thought so. Thank you.
Yeah.
What kind of open source license did you use, and do you think it affected your business?
I don't think it's affected at all. We use BSD, which is pretty acceptable for corporations. I think this matters a lot, and I've seen this because we have a big legal team at Dropbox, and they tell me it matters a lot. I would not use BSD today. I would use Apache, but it also depends on what you want to do. Like, nobody's a fan of GPL, but those licenses actually do have their uses, especially if you're doing something like this. It might be that, like there's scary ideas, and I'm not worried about them anymore, but like, what if somebody early on was like, Sentry's open source, I'm going to fork it, I'm going to build my own version of it. Yeah, and like, that's not like a real fear, but like, that is something that could happen. I mean, it would be very hard these days because we could just like take the trademark and they could do nothing with it, right? But it is a fear, and I definitely think it's an okay license to use, but like, you have to like weigh the risks and weigh like what your business model is. I think for what we do, it's okay. But if it was like you wanted to sell sell the software on site, but keep it open source so people can contribute and stuff, like maybe you would want to use a different license. But I'm also not like an expert. I Apache everything these days. I don't remember. This is like something I researched a long time ago. Do you know Heineck? Oh, patents. Yeah. But it's basically like the thing that everybody kind of recommends, like people I respect today, and it's both like we researched this at Disqus, we decided Apache or MIT is really good. Dropbox, it's like we suggest you can use BSD, but realistically, it's just like please use Apache or something. And I think it's the right decision for most open source. That is a big book.
Yeah, thank you. And first of all, congratulations on bootstrapping your business basing on open source. So this is a huge achievement. But if you would be starting now, would you still bootstrap or go for tons of VC money?
So I think the important thing is I had a job the whole time, so it made it much easier to bootstrap. Like, I wasn't worried about income. Like, for a long time, we didn't make nearly enough money to where we could pay a salary, and that actually matters a lot. But because we were able to do it in our spare time, because it was already like a product, like bootstrapping was okay for us. Like, I don't know, I have like strong opinions on VC money in that I think there's too many terrible ideas that get funding, but it does make sense in some cases. And like, I think we like talk about hypotheticals these days, and we're like, well, what if we like wanted to like grow the company bigger? Like, what if we wanted to like go crazy and say we're going to take on New Relic or like a completely like larger market, right? That would be really hard to do with only a few engineers, and without like serious income, it's really hard to get more engineers, especially like if they live in San Francisco or something where like salary is really, really high. Well, I mean, so far we are like an entirely remote company, so we'll see.
Okay, thank you.
Another question from some different viewpoint. Your model works well in the developer world, where your clients are developers and technical people. And do you think that it could be replicated for just regular internet users? For example, when creating a social network? Because I was thinking about something like Diaspora, which failed miserably. Do you think that creating such a paid but open source network would be possible?
I think it's possible. I don't remember that they had a business model at all, so I think that was one of their mistakes. I also don't think it was a great idea. I think that was another mistake. But I think, like, let's just say I'm building like an e-commerce platform. Like, that's not a developer tool or anything. But I think the fact is, like, developers are going to deal with it, and they're going to engage with it, and they're probably going to be the ones like especially if you're going to like let them self-host and stuff, because it is open source. Like, that's still strongly valuable to you, because they are going to help build things, and they're going to be like, you know, this is a really valid use case that you don't have, but I would like to like contribute it because like the platform's already really good. And I think because of that, it can like indirectly lead to like your system overall being better. And I think that's the key thing for me, is because like most of the people that use the service, they don't actually contribute. The people contributing are like the ones that are hosting it themselves, or like they're the like really small minority of technical people who are just like, oh yeah, I understand open source. I know like what Sentry is. I'm just going to contribute back stuff, even though I'm paying you money. So I think it's okay. It probably varies like the amount of success you would have in different markets, and obviously like developer tooling is much easier. But I still think it's beneficial.
Thank you.
Hi. Let's say you have a product that was not free, and it wasn't open source, and you sold it to several companies, and then you decided that that's not quite a good business, and I want to make it open source and free. How would you deal with that situation and your clients?
Mostly like, how would you convince them to keep paying you money, or?
Yes.
I think that's hard. It's always hard. I think when you change business models, like it's even hard when you just increase prices, right? Like you have to like, you feel like you have to defend what you're doing to some extent. I think in that case, I would be like, okay, I have this software. We're gonna make it open source, but like what you're paying for is specifically like our assistance or something along those lines. And I think like when we eventually try to tackle like the people who self-host, like the bigger companies, like our pitch is just gonna be like, yeah, host it yourselves. We'll come in, like we'll do like on-site support. We'll help you set it up. We might build features for you, like may or may not, you know. And I think that's actually a reasonable model. And as like an analogy for this, like there's this company called, doesn't matter what the company's called, but a product that came out of Facebook called Fabricator, which is an amazing code review tool. It's all open source. The guys who wrote it at Facebook left Facebook to work on this. They have really no business model at all to go with it. Like they keep telling themselves that eventually they're going to create like a subscription service or something. But the way they've supplemented that is like Dropbox, for example, we keep them on retainer because like we use their software. We're able to like, for me, if it's like a feel good thing, like it's great software. We keep them on retainer, so like they'll fix stuff for us. But it's also just because like we really like their software. And I think that's also a way to approach it. Like we could have done the same thing with Sentry, where it's like, we know a lot of you are using it. Can we validate just like selling you support instead of selling you software, right? I think that would be harder as a side project, which is, I wouldn't say that's why we went the direction we did, but it's definitely like something we couldn't have done with us as a side project. But I think it's completely fine to sell support and kind of like your trust for your product instead of just selling your product. This is how a lot of like the companies work, like, you know, React, Cassandra, like all these new big data, like even MongoDB, I think is exactly the same. It's like sell the enterprise support.
I'm kind of curious, how do you manage joining this working at Dropbox and doing Sentry? This is kind of impossible for me to just do.
Yeah, it's complicated. The best way I can say it is that like very separate work. Like I don't work on Sentry ever at Dropbox. We actually do use Sentry a little bit in Dropbox, and there's interest to use it more, which is exciting to me, which could validate me working on it there. But the only time I even worked on Sentry at Disqus was when I was building something that Disqus needed. So like that's how I validate working on it. Otherwise, it's like I literally only do it in the evening or something. Like, and I actually have like I'm required to have a different computer for Dropbox anyways. So like that's also how I keep it separate. Is like I only develop on my personal computer versus Dropbox stuff, which is only on my Dropbox computer. It's definitely a thing that like it's a little odd, and companies are really shady around this. Like Yahoo, for example, I have some friends that work there, and you could never get away with this at that company. So it depends on like how your company is. If it's a smaller company, it's super easy to convince them that like this is valuable. Our pitch was always like we want to hire entrepreneurs. Like as engineers, we want people who are driven to build cool things. And like if you empower them to do this kind of stuff, I think that's how you get those people. Like you build a culture around that. And in Dropbox's case, for example, like I was very clear, like up front, like I have this company. I mean, it's not going to go away. You have to be okay with that. And it was completely fine. But it very much does matter the company that you're working for. So.
Right. And how many people work on the project? Like
on Sentry?
Yep.
It's mostly just like 3 of us. There's a few people who are very dedicated who maintain some of the clients, like the Java client. There's somebody who really helps on the Python client. But then there's like me, one developer who works at Disqus, and then the designer. And that's more or less like the core team. And then it's just like once in a while you'll get somebody contributing, or like we actually see like really cool stuff from some of the people who self-host, and I can't name the companies, but like they contribute like really good stuff sometimes, like really, really, really good stuff. And it's to me that's like this bright future. Like imagine what if more of that happened, like not even just for Sentry, but for like everything, where like these companies, like Facebook has done really good at this, like they adopt open source and then they contribute significantly back to the community, and that's really cool.
Right. Thanks.
Any more questions? Thank you.
Cool. Thank you.